So, welcome everybody to this first meeting of the IFLA Futures Club, where we're joined by Masud Khokhar and Huculak. This is the first in what is going to be a series that will take place from now on and will run throughout IFLA's centenary year, which will officially start in August of this year and run through until September 2027, when IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, will turn 100. We're very keen with this to use it not just as an opportunity to celebrate what's happened in the past, the people whose actions, whose insights, whose efforts have brought us to where we are today, but also to learn from that past and to look into the future, to use our centenary as a springboard, as an opportunity to look open-eyed, consciously, purposefully, but also optimistically in particular into that future. A key part of that is therefore a strong focus on futures and futures thinking. IFLA's already been involved in this for the last 13 years at least, when we first produced our trend report. The most recent edition of this came out a couple of years ago now in 2024 and really reinforces some of those key ideas as well as providing tools. It underlines the importance, the value of futures thinking, partly as a way of building resilience, of making sure that we're not missing out, we don't have blind spots, we're not being surprised as much as we might be, and that we design strategies and plans that leave us better able to deal with an unpredictable future. It's closely linked to this is the importance of futures thinking as a form of emancipation, because of course there are plenty of other actors out there who are thinking about futures, who are trying to design them for us. The discipline of futures thinking is typically linked to organizations like the Rand Corporation, like Shell, organizations which we tend to associate more with military, with fossil fuels, with things like this. So by incorporating it into what we're doing, instead of being disempowered in the face of those who are more powerful, disempowered in the face of uncertainty, we're better placed to design something for ourselves. And finally, futures thinking can be a great way of better understanding ourselves, of looking critically at some of the assumptions that we work with, some of the things that we believe to be true and may not be, and also understanding how each other thinks and therefore build up a common basis for moving forwards in our work. So there's lots of benefits around this. What we're trying to do with this series is complement what we did with the trend report in 2024. This was very much expert-led. It drew on surveys, it drew on insights from the field. It, of course, drew very strongly on the literature review. But we're now trying to complement this by making futures thinking about the future, a core part of what libraries around the world, of what library and information workers around the world are doing themselves, to make this into a core skill, an instinct, a reflex even. And therefore, complementing that expert approach, we're looking to do something which is much more about building those skills and in particular understanding the work of people who are already incorporating this way of thinking, already incorporating this approach into their own practice. So this is what the IFLA Futures Club is for. It's an opportunity for us to hear from colleagues around the world who are doing it, to share their experiences, their ideas, the things they've learned, the things they wish they'd have done better if they'd been starting anew. And through that, we can really build up a community, a club of practice around the world. And so, last slide. We're very happy, therefore, to be joined today, the speakers, the conversationalists here who are going to launch us on this work, by Masud Khokhar from the University of Leeds, where he's the Chief Digital Information Officer, and Matt Huculak, who is the Director of Kula, the Library Futures Academy at the University of Victoria in Canada. And effectively, we're just going to let them speak, to talk to each other, to share some of their ideas and draw on them. If you do have questions, please do use the question and answer function. But before going any further, therefore, I would very much like to invite Masud to take the floor. Masud, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for that really lovely introduction. I'm also really delighted to see how brilliant the coverage of colleagues is on this call, because a lot of people are saying in the chat where they're from, and it's fantastic to see really passionate colleagues who believe in knowledge, the mission of knowledge, the mission of information, the mission of libraries across the globe. I think it's a really, really important topic for us to think about it. Libraries have always been future oriented, even though sometimes we don't of talk about it. We have been very much thinking about what does it mean to operate in the kind of world that we live in. But more recently, I think there's a more urgent need to really think about what futures will look like for us, and in particular, how it shapes what we do and how it changes the way we think about our profession, but also how the needs of our communities might shift, and therefore, what do we need to do to adapt and adjust to those things. At the same time, I would also say that it is almost impossible to predict anything in the kind of world we live in, because who would have predicted what's happening in geopolitical landscape at the moment, or who is predicting? In fact, I'm in the UK, and today there's a big turmoil in political landscape in the UK where the government leadership might change in some context. So there's really difficult things to predict. However, I think nothing should stop us from imagining the possibilities and being prepared for those possibilities. And I think there's a distinctive difference between prediction and theorizing the possibilities. And the more we can think about that, I think the more it will set us up to be able to adjust and adapt to the needs when the time comes. And today I'll share some of my thinking on what we've done in that capacity, where we are rethinking about what does it mean to be a library in a highly research intensive academic organization. What's the role of collaboration and global partnership going forward? How do we operate together in that world? And I will definitely bounce off ideas from Matt, but also share some of the things that didn't work really well, because I think it's important to share where things could have gone differently in the future as well. So I think that's all I wanted to say to begin the scene, but really keen to have this conversation and really open chat with colleagues on the call as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I love that line about moving from prediction to preparedness. I think that it's a fantastic way of looking at it and moving ourselves away from this idea of being able to know, because ultimately that's a trap and it's a route to disappointment. So excellent. So now over to Matt
Yeah, and I
and
just want
Matt
to,
Huculak to talk about, and so you've got such a great job title name.
I'm very lucky. I mean, it certainly fits the theme of today's discussion. And I just want to build and echo Masood in thanking all of our colleagues around the world who are joining us today. Masood and I are coming both from academic library contexts, so I do want to recognize that positionality. Some of you might be in a public library. I noticed someone from Internet Archive is here. So when we're thinking about fragility and futures, that's an important topic in terms of the internet and information. But, I think Masood's comment about how we've always been future oriented is really important. And I think it's because that futureness is being challenged right now that it's become so apparent and visible to us to be able to start talking about this in a meaningful way, whether that be turmoil in the UK or turmoil in the United States or Canada, wherever that may be. We have a special role to play in our given knowledge situation. Or a phrase that I really like to think about this is Christian Jacob has a phrase called sites of knowledge. In French, it's lieu de savoir. And this isn't just a physical place. It's the intellectual apparatus. It's the political situation. It's the geographical situation that enshrines the possibilities and infrastructures of knowledge. So I do want to recognize that each one of us is operating in one of those. So what Masood and I are talking about is informed by our particular lieu de savoir, but I think it has import for that global context. In the Canadian context, the situation just south of us, so Canada sits on top of the United States, has forced quite a bit of discussion in our country around our infrastructures of knowledge. Many of our services are provided by United States internet companies. Microsoft, Google tend to dominate the academic environment here. And when authorities began talking about having legal jurisdiction jurisdiction over Canadian content that is hosted by an American company, even if that server might be in Canada, that raised a lot of alarm bells, right? Because like Masud, who's talked about the global consequences and issues that we have the opportunity to think about, we also have our very specific local context. And for Canada, that local context are the Indigenous communities with whom, I personally live on the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, and we're building relationships with those local communities. And because of the challenges of colonialism, of sovereignty, the issues of data sovereignty are also at play here. So how do we think about futures, both in terms of those global issues, but also the very local issues in which we all operate and live? So to wrap up, the Kula Library Futures Academy has been formed here at the University of Victoria Libraries, thanks to a generous donation of Brian Gaines and Mildred Shaw, two academics who've lived their entire lives in the sphere of education, information science, computation, precisely to start to explore these issues. And I'm going to add one more term as we move forward, and that is experimentation. And, Masud rightly notes, we've always been concerned with the future. But a part of that concern has been our rightfully conservatism around how hard it is to preserve information over time. But with technology changing so fast, we have to create spaces for experimentation to see what's going to work. Because again, we can't predict, but we can create experiments to see what lasts.
Thank you so much for I think that introduction. Also, obviously the far-sightedness of the grantors, the funders, and actually putting money into this. Is I think you're completely right that this libraries are organized institutions that are there for the long term. I don't know. A library doesn't exist unless you actually are valuing what's going to happen in 10, 20, 50, 100 years' time. Because otherwise, why would you train researchers? Why would you train learners? Why would you bother preserving stuff if you don't believe in some sort of future? Yet at the same time, there's always that risk that it can be a bit of a trap, that we can take eternity for granted because we've always been there, and so it can always risk being there into the future. And so there's always that slight tension between, well, of course we're futures orientated institutions. That's what we're there for. I don't know, we're not just here for the day here and now. But so it would be interesting, I think, with both of you that, of course, people have been talking about futures thinking since the Rand Corporation, since the 50s, Shell taking it on in the 70s, and of course, it's really got quite big in recent years. I'd be fascinated to hear from both of you a little bit about the first time you came across the idea of futures thinking, and yeah, what made you sort of, I don't know, how did you buy into it? What was the sort of the spark, the moment at which you bought into it? So maybe Masood.
Yeah, so maybe there's something about the background here that I should mention. So I'm a computer scientist by education, and I've always been really passionate about the role that digital can play in academic or wider set of libraries. I also have libraries in my DNA. My father was a librarian. I've always been passionate about public libraries and ended up working in an academic library. The reason why I'm mentioning that is I think there's something really interesting about a leadership skill that's not often talked about, which is foresight. And whenever we talk about leadership skills, we often talk about empathy, astute strategic thinking. But in order to have those kind of things, particularly astute strategic thinking, you do need the capability to do foresight. And foresight does require you to go out of your comfort zones. It means that you don't look just at academic libraries or any libraries. You look at different sectors, you look at different innovations, you look at different experimentations, you build a culture of innovation underneath that. And one really, probably, I don't know whether it would be funny or not, but the thing that I often take really good inspiration from is airports. And I often, whenever I'm sitting at an airport, I'm looking at how are people moving through that? And actually, what's the best way in which they're streamlining certain things? How are they putting the signage up, and how are they redirecting people? How are they really advocating different services, or how are they constructing the space through so that people have to walk in a particular way to then engage with certain things? And I think in some ways, really that building that sense of thinking ahead, taking inspiration from different places, different sectors, contextualizing that in your local context, and then building something, not just say stopping there, but actually saying, now that I've got that, I'm just going to do some experimentation. And what's the worst that can happen? We don't work in a profession where major things will happen. My computer science research was in safety critical systems. If I get something wrong there, someone will die. And that's a very different consequence. But we are very reserved, and we are often risk averse as a consequence. And I think we really need to build that sense of, again, going back to Matt's point about that experimentation, take inspiration, do your foresight, build that future thinking, then experiment, because nothing's guaranteed to work unless you experiment with it and learn from that. So yeah, I took my inspiration quite early on, basically because of my computer science background, but also because I was a sponge, and I still would like to be a sponge. It doesn't matter where inspiration comes from. I have no ego in that. If someone will tell me, oh, this could be a really great idea, and if I agree with it, I would be like, absolutely, let's do something about it. So yeah, that, I think it's a mindset, it's a cultural shift, it's a way of absorbing certain things, but it sets the scene for everything else that happens underneath, particularly in those leadership positions. Um, I've been rambling on too much, but really keen to bring Matt into this conversation and really take inspiration from his source of inspiration.
Matt, go.
Thank you, Masud. First of all, Masud inspires me. I think the work you're doing in the UK has certainly been one of the guiding lights of the conversations we're having locally here at UVic. Unlike Masud, I did not come from information science. I came from the humanities. So I came to librarianship mid-career. I trained as a literature professor and came to librarianship here at the University of Victoria, actually working in the archives. So my introduction to libraries was through special collections and archives. And at a certain point, I realized, oh, I really love this work. And I went to Jonathan Bankston, who's the university librarian here, and said, I want to become a librarian. How does that happen? And that's when I learned about library school and so forth. So I pursued that. But the reason why I bring that up is the humanities, particularly in North America, have gone through radical changes over the past 20 years in particular, where the entire field has changed. So, building on what Masud mentioned about risk, the other term I want to introduce here is change management, because we are in a fast-paced world. Unlike any other time we've seen. I gave a talk last week to the Center of Religion and Society here at the university, and I showed pictures from the Royal Library of Elba and the Temple Library in Sipar, Iraq, right? And what's fascinating about these pictures from almost 5,000 years ago, you look at shelves of where clay cuneiform tablets were stored that look very similar to the shelves that we have in our libraries right now. You see clay tablets that could be books that just happen to be dusty, right? So the object material aspect of librarianship has remained fairly precise and consistent through the years until the invention of the computer. And now we're facing, vast changes in how information is stored, transferred, etc. And this is a sea change. So the idea of change management in a profession that by nature, I think, is risk averse and by necessity conservative, because we've seen things come and go. But this is a thing that isn't going to go. Right? AI is not going to go anywhere. It's going to be challenged. We'll have discussions about it, but it is fundamentally changing the way information is transferred and stored. So for me, And I do recommend folks to take as many leadership courses as they can, not because it teaches you about leading other people. What I found most interesting about leadership courses is what I've learned about myself, my own personal assumptions about change, about how organizations work, and really starting to think through, if we see a change coming, if we have an anticipation, if we do have that foresight, how do we prepare the path for people to feel comfortable to live in that change? And I think, Masud, one of the things that uh, you've really been inspirational about is providing a conversation and a vocabulary around talking about change in libraries. And one of the things we're trying to do here is providing the space. Like, if we're going to be talking about experimentation, what does that look like on the ground? How do we provide librarians, archivists, library staff members the ability to get their hands dirty in experimenting with something that might not be a viable path in the future, but at least provides a path to a certain point should that reality come to be? So when we talk about experimentation, there's a lot of change management that goes into that.
And can I also add, this is really difficult to achieve sustainably because
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure colleagues will resonate with this, but everyone feels so busy and
Mm-hmm.
there is so much work pressure or so much to do and not enough time. And it becomes really difficult on how do we create a culture where we allow people to have the space, as you said, to experiment while also be able to do what they're needing to do at the same time. And I think it's a change of philosophy to some level at the same time as creating the space around that to enable people to do something which is as valuable as what they do normally, but may not feel in that moment that that is as valuable. Because when you're experimenting, you're not seeing the full purpose of something. You're not seeing the full outcome of something. You don't know what it might lead to. That is absolute part of learning. That is essential outcome, but can sometimes be considered as, but it's coming at the expense of something that I know and can deliver, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore the importance of prioritization can sometimes shift. So I just wanted to say it's a hard problem, but it is such an important one for us to focus on.
And it's difficult to equate. I know it's something that humans generally are bad at. We don't value the future as much as we value the present. And so something that may pay off subsequently, we don't, I don't know, we don't see it, we don't give it the same value, and so we think, well, I don't know, it's not in my face right now. It's not, it's not that immediate pressure. I, I will ask in a minute for you both actually then to talk about that experience of trying to create that space, because I think that's a really an interesting one to go down. But I want to start with an even harder question, which wasn't on the list I sent beforehand. Uh, I'm taking what I know all that's been said about the very rapid change that we're in, and we can have all that talk about being about VUCA and sort of volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity and so on, and we've also seen, the administration in your southern neighbour, Matt, sort of deliberately mess things around as quickly as possible to put people off balance, and it's I don't know, it's a strategy for some to sort of take power, to take control by shaking things around and creating that uncertainty that causes everyone to panic and go all over the place. I know it is a strategy that gets used. How would you characterize the way that libraries of a field have gone about adapting to change so far? Because we're not nowhere, and I don't know, there are bright spots of what's happened. I'm asking you to make a horrible generalization here, so feel free to simplify massively. Maybe let's start with Matt, given that Masood spoke last.
Sure, and I think this is where our traditional values really matter. So let's take our neighbor to the south, the United States. If you've joined late, the libraries have remained a vibrant place of community engagement. So there's Kula sponsored a film screening of a documentary called The Librarians, which I do recommend to every librarian on this call, anyone interested or involved with information management, because it's about a Southern public librarian who stands up to, I would say, extreme bullying that is reflected at the highest levels of government now. And I think for the North American audience, that type of bullying at that level is new. And I think it's exactly what you say, Stephen. It's a way of gaining power by disrupting the equilibrium. So our traditional values that we can stand on as public libraries, as academic libraries, it creates a bulwark for us to gather and support one another. And I think this is going to be, at least in that framing of the question, the most important part about library futures is having a global understanding and commitment to one another, no matter where we are, because it could be any one of us, to support one another at our core values. How we define those values, I think, is up for discussion. For me, I am committed to democracy, civic life, but I understand in many other places and countries, that vocabulary might be different. But there is a core value to librarianship about preservation, information. I think I saw Brian Alexander pop up and say, to be a good ancestor is a good framing. And that will never end. 5,000 years ago, 5,000 years from now, that's a value that is persistent. Masud, what about you?
I think there are two things that I feel as universal about libraries. One, well, not just about libraries, but about what we do. One, we will always care about knowledge. And two, we will always face people who are attacking that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
That's been our history, that's the present, and that's going to be the future. And this goes back to that value proposition. Again, I recognize that local context will be different, but I would never imagine that any librarian or library will say we don't care about knowledge or we don't want to safeguard the sanctity of knowledge. And the other thing that's fairly common is our communities, and we are here to really provide that knowledge in a equal fashion wherever that's possible to our communities. So if we set the scene that knowledge will always be attacked and knowledge will always remain our core mission, I think that's where some of the big questions start emerging. And this is some of the work we are doing at the moment at Leeds about actually, while AI is really, really important and shifting and will continue to shift the way we do, we're actually saying, let's not just think about AI as a technology, but what impact it will have on the whole knowledge ecosystem as a consequence. So Matt's mentioned information preservation, Matt's mentioned information sharing. I think we are going back to the core of what is knowledge generation in its own right now. And that's really starting the questions for us about, so we are establishing a knowledge institute based in the University of Leeds libraries, very much taking inspiration from the Kula Academy. So the inspiration goes both ways. And one of our mission is to really focus on three core parts of that knowledge ecosystem. One is knowledge equity. So what does it mean to equitably produce, share, access, preserve knowledge for all communities to benefit from? And within that, we are absolutely serious about what are some of the implications of decolonization on knowledge, what are different knowledge systems across the globe, and how do we appreciate that and really take that into account? How do we build knowledge together wherever we can? There's so many dimensions, but for the sake of times, I won't go into all the details. The other area that, again, goes back to Matt's point about the Canadian southern neighbors is we are really generally concerned about knowledge security. We are increasingly seeing knowledge being weaponized, either to write partisan perspectives out there or to provide a very different narrative to what the actual real knowledge argument was. And we've seen deep fakes, we've seen huge collapses of economy because very different kind of narrative was painted. We've also seen the US Cloud Act and what it might mean in terms of monopolies having access to knowledge, which is sovereign to a nation. So there are so many angles here that we are genuinely talking. I think Matt mentioned data sovereignty. We're talking about knowledge sovereignty, knowledge security. How do we protect our democracies and communities from the abuse of knowledge or weaponization of knowledge in that context? And then the third element here is about digital ethics and its impact on knowledge, because when you are in a kind of environment where knowledge can be manipulated and knowledge can be used, it has a huge impact on human rights and the ethical implications of that. Is all knowledge production the right knowledge production? I think that's an even more interesting question to ask. Do we accept knowledge that's being unethically produced? Not that I have a particular view, but I think those becomes really, really interesting, really core mission questions that we were always inquiring, but at the tenacity or at the scale at which we have to inquire is a very different ballgame now. And I think it takes me back to the core mission of the libraries. It's all about knowledge and sharing, accessing, preserving, generating that knowledge. So that huge fundamental shift is going to be big for us as a profession.
And just to follow up on that, absolutely agreed with everything you said, Masud. The library has traditionally been an endpoint of knowledge production, right? Happening in the disciplines and the libraries. And I think one of the reasons why Masud's Institute and the Academy are so important is because of these changes that are happening so fast. We have to be looking down that pipeline to say, okay, how do we get involved at the very beginning of this process? One example, the peer review crisis. We're talking about a peer review crisis in the North American university. This might be a global problem. When I started my PhD, I worked on a journal called the James Joyce Quarterly, which was started in the 1960s in the garage of a scholar in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? If you've ever been in Tulsa, Oklahoma, wonderful city, but it's an unlikely place for the James Joyce Quarterly to be born. But it created a community and became a global part of a site of knowledge supporting this particular study. Today, it's really hard to find people to do peer review because that sense of community is dissipated. Masud, you've already talked about how busy people already are. That's including academics, right? So this notion that academics can sit around and leisurely peer review a journal article is of a time that is past. So if the publishing industry, or the cloud deck in which that publication network now exists, is really changing how knowledge is preserved and transmitted, and yet our entire library ecosystem is still set up for that previous generation of knowledge creation, we have issues that start to rise, and we're still prepared to deal with it. So I think this is another reason why we need to think about the future, because the future is already here in many ways. And we need to be experimenting and thinking through with one another what that means.
I think just coming out of that, I know that I think I will then move on to that question of how you do things internally, though. I think that there's a pretty key point that what you were saying, Matt, about I was trying to think about how you draw the diagram of the place of libraries within the knowledge ecosystem, moving from being the endpoint to sort of being in parallel with some things and being circular with other things and being spread across other and then rapidly my imagination ran out of graphic imagery to actually demonstrate that. But I don't know, I think that there's a question in there about what we can do internally to make sure that we're stepping up that sort of Aristotelian planes of like why, and from the day-to-day activities like why do we do that and why do we do that and why do we do that, to actually take that much broader picture and be able to see ourselves as being in the same ecosystem as actors that we might not have thought of before and realize that they're partners. But I did want to go back to saying, the number of topics that we're covering so far is pretty vast, and we can't get our heads around all of them. But I think, as you've both been saying, that power of experimentation, that ability to look at something and not take it as being a sacred cow and not take it as being an immovable truth that cannot be questioned, that will be there forever, and actually sort of poking it, testing it, experimenting with it. I'd be fascinated to hear more about your experience in both your cases of building that culture of how to do what do you need to do practically to move people into that space where they can see maybe they can't control change, maybe they don't know change, but at least they can feel empowered in the face of change. Masood,
Do you want to
maybe.
go? Okay, do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I think Matt talked last.
Right, now realize we're taking turns, Matt. Um, I do want to say this. It's a hard problem because it is about change, and it is also about not just change management, it is also about transition management, because people are slightly different to how we manage change, and how we manage people are two slightly distinctive things. And I would I would say there are a few things that we've done that just to some level have worked. Firstly, I think it is very much about setting the tone from a strategic viewpoint about the kind of culture we want to develop. So in 2021, when we were drafting our vision for the libraries here, one of the very explicit thing we said was one of the core enabling themes for us is to develop a culture of innovation. And we really started putting that at the core enabler entity of we cannot continue to thrive if we don't build a culture of innovation. But we also added some very core strategic objectives, which on the surface may seem superficial, but they showed intent, or were a demonstrator of intent. For example, one of our strategic priorities very explicitly say that we will actively pursue technologies and experiment with them to then determine whether they're the right things for us or not. Now, very few libraries ever talk about actively pursuing technologies because our general belief is that technologies should support what we do. But I think this is again a shift in tone and a shift in mindset of actually there is no issue in pursuing, and if it's not the right technology, it's fine. We've learned from that particular thing. So I think the very first step is to change the tone of the strategic intent behind what we are trying to build together. The second thing then is to create that level of capacity and culture which supports that. I don't think we have cracked the capacity question. I think the capacity will probably be in peaks and troughs, because there will be times when business as usual takes over, and then there are times when there's more capacity to do some experimentation. And I don't want to be suggesting that we are absolutely amazing and we've got this cracked, because that's not the answer. But it does allow people to be able to experiment with certain things when they have the time, and then encourage them and support them. Money does help. Let's not argue about that, because if you have money and you can create some incentives around that, that does help. But money is not the only motivator that helps achieve some of this cultural shift as well. And I think that's really critical. One other thing I would say is, and I think again it's a leadership slash cultural thing, is talk about failures and celebrate them to some level. We started talking about in our executive team things that didn't work out, including very personally when I applied for something. I was applying for a board position, and I got very outrightly rejected at stage one. And I shared that with my team, saying I did that. I thought I was well qualified. They initially thought I was well qualified, but then they said, "Nah, you're not good enough."
Yes, their
That's
loss, I'm
okay.
sure. It's fine.
That's very kind, but I think it's just about really not, because when you create a culture where that experimentation can be then looked at, oh, that's a failure. Why are we so resistant to that thing that we don't want to do something that might fail? And there is no such thing. You learn in that journey, you learn in that experimentation, you learn in that culture. So I think there is definitely that angle. So there are lots of little things, but I do believe it does come from the strategic intent shift from the very beginning about actually we do want to create a culture, we do want to create a library where this is actually celebrated and appreciated and supported. There are lots of practical tips, but I won't go into that.
Great, thank you. And I think it'd be fascinating. I don't know, maybe we'll go to Matt first, but I'd be fascinated to hear also just on practically what that then looks like if we're trying to find responses to some of those knowledge challenges. I don't know, what does experimentation look like around, sorry, to go back to my notes around doing knowledge in a more equitable manner. I don't know, when you identify a challenge and trying to find, and maybe it doesn't work, but I don't know, hell, we've learned something, that's good. We can learn from that. I don't know, some, I don't know, attacking some of these big philosophical issues and then turning them into a set of practical experiments which at least inch us forwards.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we haven't addressed here is how to capture failure well, right? And I, again, absolutely agree with everything Masud says. You know, a lesson we learned in the digital humanities, because there was a culture that arose around failure and celebrating failure, precisely what Masud is talking about it. And sort of the patron saint of failure, Samuel Beckett, who has this wonderful line, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better, fail again, fail better, right? And how do we capture practically the failing better? And in many ways, time has done that work for us in the past. Ideas operate in society and go through the sifting process over time. It worked or it didn't. You know, we mentioned Shell, right? And knowledge. You know, back in the 70s, they had the knowledge, for example, that global climate change was a thing, or that combustion engines could potentially affect the climate. What happened with that knowledge, right? Was it put into practice, et cetera, et cetera? So how do we think about engaging knowledge in this experimental way to fail better? For Kula, one of the things we're doing is creating something called seed grants. So as Masud pointed out, money is great. Incentivizing failure is good, because sometimes that failure blossoms into something quite beautiful, right? So what the seed grants are is we have a certain amount of money each year put aside for librarians, archivists, all library staff, as a matter of fact, to submit proposals on affecting library services. How do we make our library better for our users? And, you know, Masud talked about that top-down thing, but at the very top, you have to enshrine failure being okay, right? And normally top-down stuff doesn't really play that well in the North American context, but this is the one time where it does. If you can put failure and experimentation as part of your strategic directions, that sort of gives permission for people to start thinking that it's okay, right? And it may take a couple of years for that to sort of sink in, because there also has to be trust that you won't be punished for failing. And this is a complex social issue because we are employees to an organization. The way we've set up our performance reviews doesn't reward failure unless you put that in as one of the requirements of the job. How did you fail this year? And let's celebrate that. So practically speaking, the seed grants, I think, allow people to do that type of experimentation, to build relationships, to think outside the box of traditional librarianship, to see how it works. And then it allows us to examine, can this be operationalized at scale? Sometimes it can't be, sometimes it can. But even if it can't be, that local relationship still might be important. So I think celebrating failure, as Masud says, is important. Having incentives absolutely is important. And then finally, capturing failure so it can be analyzed. So, you know, I think of you at your table, Masud, admitting that you didn't get this position on the board. Normally I might feel shame admitting that, but if I see leadership celebrating that, then I know, oh, this is normal. This is okay. This is just part of the job. I have to develop a sort of resilience towards failure, and that will make me stronger and keep trying, et cetera, et cetera. So at a local level, resilience might just be writing a blog post. And this is what I ask of folks who work with me. They get very annoyed at me because I'm like, that's great. Write a blog post about it. So we can learn and we can sort of see an analysis perhaps over time. So celebrating failure, capturing failure, and developing resiliency within the organization and personally, I think are all key components here.
You want
Fantastic.
me to
Please,
cite
yeah,
some
go for it.
practical examples, Stephen, or
Yes, no, that would be good because I think Matt, you're already talking about that encouraging experimentation in library services. I think that leads on perfectly.
so I was thinking about what's the best examples I can give, and I picked up on two. So one again is kind of foresight. So back in 2022, we were thinking about actually this is before ChatGPT became big and AI wasn't the buzzword of etc. And we're thinking we do think that AI will have an impact, but we don't know what it might be. And of course, particularly in metadata areas, we do knew that AI was going to have some level of impact. So we basically decided we're going to recruit a postdoc and we're going to ask her to just do some work around AI. And Dr. Luba was fantastic. She did quite extensive interviews across the place, including within our own library. And we just published a report around that, which is probably way out of date now. But actually what it signified was that one of the things that we are seriously looking at is what would be the impact of some of these technologies on how we operate. And if I speak very openly, I think some of the biggest resistance was from metadata and cataloging areas because naturally it felt like, oh, this could change the way we work. And change is not, it's not even change that people fear, it's loss that people fear. And what would I lose if something will change in my domain? But then that team now at the moment is one of the most exciting and innovative teams in the library because they went through that transition. They went through that transition of, oh, I don't like this, to, oh, okay, let's experiment with this, to how do we innovate with this? And now they're doing some amazing work. And I think that's something, a story that I personally really celebrate because I was unsure at the beginning of whether that will be the case, but they've been amazing. And then the other thing I wanted to share was last year, an idea spanned in our heads about, well, we are genuinely worried about the future of knowledge, but we are not yet sure what we want to focus on. So why don't we just do something? And we really wanted to get to that, what is it that we really want to do? Because all of us had this kind of thinking, and I've got an amazing team in the library here, and I know Jonathan's got an amazing team in Victoria as well. And I said, let's start working towards a future symposium. And we basically created a knowledge future symposium that was hosted inaugurally last year. And the whole idea there was that we are genuinely worried about future of knowledge equity. We are genuinely worried about some of these areas. Let's bring lots of really great inspirational, great speakers together. And what we were really keen to understand is we bring librarians, archivists, information specialists, academics, researchers, members of public, your research council people. If we bring a set of people together and we bring a set of people from across the globe together who bring different perspectives, what does that tell us? And it was an idea that spanned within a few months to actually host something. It's risky. It may have failed. We had really good attendance, both in person and online. But what it really helped us do is cement our ideas about we genuinely believe this is the right thing for us to focus on. And actually also narrowed down our scope into what are we going to focus on? Knowledge equity, knowledge security, knowledge and digital ethics, because we believe those are going to be fundamental questions in the next 2 or 3 years. Again, from an idea and inception to a reality, it will come with a risk, but that's exactly the kind of thing we need to do.
But also the speed of getting that together. Just because something is a good idea and needs to be done well, it doesn't need 2 years planning to do it properly. It is
We
possible
don't
to do
live in that
something
world
important
anymore.
quickly. I'm sure it was stressful at the time, but I really like that, and that links to that question of how to, which I will get back to, about how do we build that mindset and learn how to think big and think outside the areas that we normally feel are within our power, within our grasp. Um, and I did also really like that example of talking about persuading some of the teams that may have been most resistant, because I know it's quite normal as a human being. You want to think that the work you are doing is important, and everyone wants to think they're unique. Then that's quite standard. It's not unique, ironically enough. And so actually getting beyond that idea that the work you're doing can be replaced, and going through that sort of grieving process and moving successfully to that sense of wanting to experiment, wanting to innovate, wanting to own and take control of something. I know that's an impressive success. And then the other thing I just wanted to bring out there is that, and you both talked very much about that idea of failure, and don't hold me to it. I'd love the idea at library conferences that we actually have a celebration of failure, and it's only speakers who've tried something and it hasn't worked, but actually to send that signal and overcome it. You get the problem of publication bias in medical science, where it's the unsuccessful clinical trials that never get written up and published. That's a great way of wasting money and killing people, because you're not talking about the failures. And no, obviously in medical science, that's a life or death issue.
Mhm.
Fortunately, it's not a life or death issue within librarianship, but it's a great way of wasting time and slowing down progress. And so getting that to happen would be, I don't know, yeah, fascinating to go down. Maybe then, I don't know, it would be, so I've talked far longer than I was supposed to be doing there, but I think that idea about, and it's come back to the idea of getting people to think big. And so, I don't know, Masood, you ran the symposium on knowledge futures, and of course, I know it's great to come along and actually see there's all these other people with different job titles and different hats on, who are actually worried and thinking about the same thing, and they may not be using the same vocabulary or references or framing, but there's a common awareness that knowledge is something that is important and cannot be taken for granted. Um, how, how's that sort of fed into the way that people are now thinking? And do you see that's changing mindsets, that's changing a sense of being part of that broader ecosystem?
It does, definitely. I think the very first thing it has done is it has opened up our own horizons about the global challenges on knowledge, not in the local bubble that we often live in. And Matt was highlighting this earlier about the local context, because the local context in the UK is very different to the local context in Canada, which is very different to the local context in India, which is very different to the local context in Africa or Latin America or in Southeast Asia. And when you bring that kind of landscape together, firstly, you realize how small we are in our own little bubbles, but also you realize that while the challenges are vast or locally contextualized, the core fundamentals are still the same. And how do we really build that sense of global collaboration to tackle some of these together? Which is why when I was starting this conversation, I think the answer to this is not local, it is global, especially if you want to do it at scale. But local routing is so critical to answer the actual global challenges. So yeah, just want to reiterate that it's changed our mindsets and our horizons about what does it mean to think about knowledge in a global landscape. The second thing I would say is that it's also changed our mindsets about what the capacities or the purchasing slash socioeconomic capacities of different libraries and different capabilities are. I'm in a very privileged situation where I'm part of a large research intensive university here in the UK. And yes, while we have financial difficulties in comparison to many, many other academic libraries or public libraries or school libraries or prison libraries, we are in a very privileged position. So how do we build a network or a system where we actually collaboratively do this and really build on everyone's capabilities, skills, insights, wisdom, financial capacity where that exists together? So I think it's also changed the perspective on what collaboration looks like and what truly genuine partnership in that collaboration looks like. That also applies to our communities because quite often, and I'm just being very open and blunt here, the previous model of knowledge sharing was the West produces it and everyone else consumes it. And I think that's not the model that we agree with or adhere to. Western knowledge system has its own importance and other knowledge systems have their own importance. And actually, we're really encouraging ourselves to think about what does it mean to co-produce knowledge, which is contextualized in different regions and different landscapes. It's just a very it changes the way you think, and it changes the way you develop your approaches, and it changes the way you you start thinking about knowledge as a global ecosystem that you are influencing rather than you're changing for the whole world.
Exactly, and you need to start thinking, and it's similar to the futures thing in general, that rather than thinking that your experience is central and it's the Copernican shift, but accepting that everyone is out there and orbiting. Matt, your experience at Victoria.
Well, I want to just follow up on something Masood said about the Institute. The other thing we haven't discussed is the power of bringing people together in person, right? Now, I think the Zoom the COVID, post-COVID, uh, having things available online, like this discussion, very important, right, in terms of accessibility. But there is something special that happens when humans from different perspectives, different cultures come together and live in the same space for a few days, talk about things. And it's not just about librarians learning from those outside sources, but it's also the outside learning who we are and what we do, what our core values are right now, what our challenges are right now. So I don't want to underestimate the libraries being involved in these institutes and bringing people together in person as well as online. That's one thing. The other thing I think sort of we skipped over was the fact of the postdoc in the library, uh, right? Because it's bringing in an outside perspective to examine our challenges. And when we become too insular, when we only address a problem by the way we think we should be addressing a problem, we might miss out on that outside vision that is exactly what we need at that precise moment. So I encourage, this is how I started in the library. I was the UVic Library's first postdoctoral fellow. That's what sparked my love of libraries and the work. Currently, we have a graduate student fellow who we have fellowships available for graduate students. And we hired a student named Chloe Farr from the computer science department. She has revolutionized the work we're doing in the library in just 6 months. And not fancy, we have determined what AI is going to be in the library for the future. She's just used language models to take legacy optical character recognition, which may have an accuracy rate of 30%, and made it 99 to 100% correct, which means all of a sudden, the digital archive we thought we had has now been augmented and has an accuracy rate we never anticipated. Because again, I had to remember, oh yeah, in 2005, OCR was at a particular stage and version of technology, and it's gotten much better since then. So having a computer science graduate student examine this problem with our metadata unit is wonderful. And, it is funny that metadata has become one of the most exciting areas in the library, because in the past, they've sort of been behind the scenes cataloging books. And Masud, you mentioned that feeling of loss, but what happened when we started purchasing books that came metadata ready, where we just brought it into our catalog? It allowed us to focus on special collections and archives, which is the remaining physical frontier that remains undescribed in many institutions. So now the metadata area is now working with special collections and archives, which have their own standards of description and so forth, and sparking discussion of how do we bring together a library catalog and finding aids that have been developed over centuries of separate professions. So these are all issues that are constantly churning and happening within the institution. And I think creating those live personal connections cannot be underestimated. So, I hope in the future, and I'm just spitballing here, but if IFLA has an event, having scholarship programs, so even if it is at the last minute, allowing someone to fly in to Masud's Knowledge Institute, right? I'm excited about that Knowledge Institute. It gives us a light in the sky to fly towards, to say, yes, these are discussions that need to be had. And it helps unite us around global common ideas that I think we all share.
And I think it's something we certainly run into on the IFLA side, that it would be, it's so refreshing when you have someone from outside the field coming in and offering their perspective. So getting a sociologist, getting an anthropologist, getting people who come from the obviously computer scientists. So you have Masud here. We've got Chloe at University of Victoria. Just providing that experience is good, and then finding that balance between obviously the professional pride, the understanding that libraries are valuable and do have a unique role and something to contribute, but also the humility to be ready to let others in and be ready to accept that we don't know best
Mm-hmm.
always, which applies both in, sort of working globally, but also in working in an interdisciplinary way. I'd be fan, I don't know, again, so this is a bit of a rabbit hole, and I would say, please, anyone who's listening in, please do use the question and answer function if you have questions that you want to ask. I'd be fan just to hear a little bit more about that experience of bringing together, for example, the metadata people with the computer science people, and what you had to go through to make that work, and what you learned about the way that libraries work by putting up the mirror in front of them, someone from outside the sector.
Sorry, I was just reading a question that came up. Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, hang on, I'll read this as well. It might be more interesting than my question. Um, we'll get onto that because I like the idea of radical collaboration. I think that point, that effect and the radical, by definition, going back to the roots is interesting. No, I said what I was. It was just a follow up to what you sort of touched on, talking about. I think it was Chloe, as a computer science postdoc coming in and working with people, and then Masood, you mentioned getting a postdoc in. That's a cultural experience of people in the library field suddenly having someone from outside, but who is among them and effectively serving as a sort of mirror. And I don't know what that experience brought out. I know I'm asking you to talk on behalf of other colleagues, which I'm conscious that
I
it would
can
be
I
even
can
better
speak
if
on
they were
behalf of
there doing it.
myself.
But yeah, okay, yes, that's good.
And this is the naughtiest thing I'll probably say today, but my first day as a postdoc in the library, a library colleague came up to me and handed me an article that said why postdocs don't belong in the library. And I looked at it and thought, oh, okay. That sort of set a tone, but it did represent a feeling at the time, right? That this is a threat. This is a change somehow that will, I don't know, that's a threat to my self-identity. I wasn't there to threaten anyone. I was there to ask different questions, right? So I think what that brought home to me was, one, going back to the original question, the importance of change management, of thinking of that. But then people became acclimated to that, right? In the sense that, oh, the world didn't change when this postdoc was scurrying around in the archives. Chloe's here. She's not threatening anyone's position. She's adding to the work we're doing, and in fact, asking a lot of questions, trying to understand, what I do and how she might be of help to my work as it is now. So I think shifting the idea from outside as threat to outside as recognition of the value I bring to an organization is key there. So that's just one example that I can give, and it's part of a larger, slow cultural shift that I think we'll all experiment. And if I can finish, okay, I'll finish on one more controversial topic. Our library schools need to be responding to this in a much more blatant way of making sure that change management is a required course, that understanding computer systems is a required course. In North America, academic librarians and public librarians go through the same streams. So, maybe having a discussion earlier on about where those streams separate, like we have our shared values courses, and then, we do have to understand AI now within the library context, no matter who you are. So that's going to take time. That's going to be library schools responding to market demand forces, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just a slow cultural change that we have to anticipate, but also incentivize and encourage. Masud, what do you think?
Yeah, on that last note, I can't agree more, because one of the things, and shout out to the iSchool at Sheffield, because they were one of the early ones who recognized that. And I used to give an annual lecture at the very first module of that program, where I would go and talk about the changing dynamics of the libraries and what are some of the challenges and what are some of the opportunities that come with that. And I remember early days of open access, talking about open access and how that would shift the access to knowledge question, talking about digital preservation, talking about AI, talking about leadership challenges. What does it mean? Post-COVID challenges. What does it mean to really build a team in that environment? And I think you're spot on. We really need to build a more dynamic curriculum in library schools to really look at the need of current environment that we are in. I think the other thing, going back to your original question, Stephen, I also want to highlight that we not only just recruited a postdoc, we actually recruited multiple academics in the library, and with very precise kind of things. So we created a new unit. Well, unit is the wrong word; it's a very tiny unit. But we created a hub called Digital Creativity and Cultures, and we made our first academic appointment for Professor Simon Popple in there. And Simon, and that's a joint appointment between Leeds Arts and Humanities Research Institute and the libraries, where we're basically saying that Simon is going to work in building digital creativity and culture on top of our collections. And it's resulted in some absolutely amazing outcomes. One that I would highlight, because we have a large numismatics collection, so a big coin collection, and we do a lot of work with students on how they can come and use technologies. And turned out that one, of course, we have a very high spec scanning equipment unit, but students were thinking, well, not everyone can have it. So they actually created a similarly, not similarly spec, but a similarly capable unit in a shoebox. And they said, can we have some funding to commercialize that and think about it? And that's a really interesting innovation that came out from really working through an academic student internships kind of angle around that. We then also hired a professor in open education, because we are really genuinely believing that the future of education has to be more open. Otherwise, we are, like with publishing, we are stuck in these closed loop systems. But what that did is it actually created a much more, I can't think of a better word than oomph behind the initiative around open education, because librarians talking about can sometimes feel like, well, the libraries are always passionate about open access and they don't understand how the whole dynamics work in publishing. But actually, professor of open education coming and talking about why this is so critical for knowledge equity, for knowledge acquisition, for knowledge production and knowledge sharing, brings a very different dynamic to that landscape. And then we created that internal partnership within the library between our catalog metadata teams, open education teams, and those appointments in that context. So yeah, we've been doing this kind of different thinking, different trial and error. Something works, something doesn't work. Something is for the long run, something is for a short period, like 2 or 3 years. Those things fundamentally shift the not just the dynamic, but also the positioning of the library across the institution. That we are not just a service provider unit, we are academic partnership unit, or we are a
Mhm.
scholarship unit, which is equally really important.
And I think that that's a proactive, that readiness to do it, to host, to be seen as a thinking part of the institution and of the community as well. I'm conscious that you're both university librarians, but none of these ideas are necessarily exclusive to what happens within universities, where obviously people are paid to think more or less. And thank you. I think also that those examples are, and it's a really nice examples of like having someone in who helps us to hold up that mirror and also helps us to get better at finding those sorts of emergent futures that are there. So we've got you've been very restrained in not answering your boss's question, Matt, but maybe we'll get to it now. So we've got one question in the chat, one question in the Q&A. I think Jonathan got there first with the chat question about how you define radical in capital letters collaboration in the context of library futures and working together at scale to make the best of what we have, the resources that we have. So, I don't know, maybe I might go to Matt first because I know you were reading it very rudely while I was asking my
I
question.
know, I'm so sorry,
It's
but I
fine.
saw the
He's the
name and
boss.
was
It's
like,
fine. I get it. I get it. It's fine. So yeah, in compensation, you get to go first.
oh, all right. Well, if we think of radical like in its
Yep.
historical context, right? And I'm gonna, so when I think of radical, I think of like the leveler in England, these
Yeah.
people who upset traditional um, imperial and let's say unjust, right? I don't think radicalism comes out of just societies, right? So there's a certain danger to radicalism. And I think it's a word that's appropriate now is because we see the outside threat to our profession, which encourages us to really start questioning and asking and experimenting what we need to be doing to anticipate this. So, to give you an example, we have a wonderful colleague in Germany at TIB Hanover named Lambert Hiller. He's doing really interesting work in terms of knowledge preservation, and particularly knowledge is at risk. So, let's say you have an archive in the United States, or here in Canada, we have the largest transgender archive in the world. Let's say someone in power comes in and decides we're going to ban this type of knowledge. What Lambert's proposing is that we use existing pirate networks, not pirate networks, peer sharing networks, which can be used for piracy. But what if we were to use those for libraries? And we had these safe havens around the globe. And if we need to quickly move a collection out of a geographical location onto a secure server in Germany, for example, how could we do that? Now, to me, that's radical thinking, right? On many levels, but it's also important thinking and building those networks now is probably important. So I think radical also means challenging, existing social structures that have developed in the library over 100 years in North America. We have about 100 years of academic librarianship tradition that has protected people's jobs, and I think people should have jobs should be protected. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but how do we get out of the thing of, oh, this is what my job is here? It's been written down for the past 100 years, and it doesn't mention AI. That's a challenge, right? So what does it mean to be radical in that context? So I think radicalism challenges us to really interrogate what our assumptions are, but also challenges leadership to respond in a meaningful way so that people can be radical and not be punished for it, so that we don't get to a place where we're caught without a plan when a real challenge does emerge at our particular location. And as Masud said, We have a very long history, and we know those challenges will always exist. So that's what radicalism means to me.
Fantastic. I think that point about looking again at the structures, making sure we're going down to really what matters again, the roots of the thing. I think that example from Germany is fantastic because it's true. It's one of those things where the idea of distributing a collection and having it in many different places is one that clearly doesn't work in the physical world in the same way,
Mhm.
but it's also a revolt against putting everything on Amazon Web Services. And so, I
Exactly.
don't know. I really like that as a model of a very different way of thinking that also implies a sort of a decentralization of power in
Mhm.
inverted commas that may be uncomfortable. And I like that example. Masood.
And Matt's answer is so superb that I'm now thinking about what can I do to add anything to that. The only thing I would potentially add to that is recognize that it's going to be difficult and it's going to take time and it will require a lot of self-reflection because let's be honest, collaboration is hard and often is built on trust. And we're not yet there where we have systems of collaboration. We are at relationships-based collaborations at the moment. And that's, don't get me wrong, relationships-based collaborations are absolutely exceptionally important. That's how we start. One of the really important, the Victoria University Library and University of Leeds libraries have a memorandum of understanding, but that basically came because an initial interaction happened and then shared value streams came through and shared ideas came through. It is built on that. And now we've changed that from a relationship-based model to a more systems-based model where there is a proper definition of that collaboration. But it's hard and we've not yet operationalized our collaboration to the level that we would like to see because that will also be hard. It will require compromises, it will require sacrifices, it will require sometimes not agreeing everything to 100%, but accepting that 80% is good enough. And it will take longer. And I think those things can sometimes be um, the disadvantages to the kind of natural human instinct of I want to get something done, and that's the quickest way of doing it, but you will solve less than 1% of the puzzle that way. So I just wanted to highlight that, yeah, do absolutely. That is the only answer to solve global challenges and even local challenges. But recognize that you have to have the patience and perseverance and that genuine belief in that collaboration is the right answer and you're not going to compromise on that value.
Indeed, and also the getting beyond the idea of not necessarily having your name on the top. I think what you said about 80% is more than good enough, but again, it's a very human thing to want to be able to see your thing and to see what you did, and it's difficult to move away from that. I was going to go. There's also Brian's question in the Q&A, which the question is how might libraries best build up shared knowledge about the impact of AI on the world? And I might build on that a little bit, and it comes back to actually something that you were both saying at the beginning about libraries being quite a propitious place for thinking about futures because often a lot of those emergent futures, those key ideas that will actually change the world in future, they're there somewhere in the library collection. I don't know. It's a lot of the time. I don't know. What was it, the Asimov quote about the future is here? It's just not very equally distributed as
Mhm.
yet. And so, in the same way, the future is in our collections. It's in one bit of our collection. It's just the case of getting it out. And so, I feel that is building on Brian's point about making the most of what we have as as a knowledge infrastructure, a partially, incompletely, imperfectly connected knowledge infrastructure. And what do we do then to draw on that in order to get inputs, get ideas out that can help us identify those emergent futures and those potential responses?
Well, Stephen, this seems like a very good segue to talk about IFLA because
Are you going to task us?
actually, yes,
Excellent,
yes,
great.
Stephen,
Okay.
I'm gonna. No, I mean, I think it's true. IFLA is an international federation right? So we're all federated of a shared value. I'll be attending my first IFLA conference this summer. And, you know, when we meet colleagues from around the world and learn about their local, you know, context, their local struggles, their local successes, it gives us that global vision, right? To understand what that 80% actually is in a living way, right? To follow up on what Masud's saying there, like we have to understand. And so I think IFLA does have a very unique role as an existing 100 years old, right? As an existing structure for us to have these conversations. So this is, I think, an important discussion to be having as a first thing. But I would love to encourage IFLA to continue these conversations, to continue collating reports that are happening locally around the world on AI so that we can learn from one another. And I think Masud's, you know, model of the Institute, Kula had our launch last year that we're going to try to repeat on an annual basis as well, to provide these satellite opportunities to meet and gather. And I don't know, Masud, can we call it the 80% Institute of, you know, developing these shared values around technology and really learning from each other in a global context? You know, again, echoing what Masud said, we have existed within in North America, a Western framework, but that's not how knowledge works anymore. And how do we feed other knowledges into our systems and make that meaningful? So that's, I'm going to throw that problem at you, Stephen.
And could I add one thing to that last point? It's not even how I think the whole domain of knowledge transfer has also changed, because previously the typical time frame in which knowledge would transfer would be generational, or the knowledge domain would change, would be generational. You come into work, things will take 20, 30 years, industrial revolution will take 50, 100 years. We are now in a world where the landscape is shifting in 5 to 10 years kind of timeframes, or sometimes even more urgently. And that has a very different impact on the workforce and the way we operate and the way we feel the cognitive overload all the time. But it is something we have to work to cope with. On what does it mean that we can work with, for example, let's pick Brian's question about how do we share all the knowledge about AI. To be honest, I have no way having all the knowledge about AI, and I lead the AI strategy for the university because there is so much there. So the power of convening becomes so important. And I think Matt's spot on. Organizations like IFLA are absolutely critical in kind of one convening those kind of channels through many, many other parties, including the kind of institutes that we are talking about, but also potentially curating, potentially developing learning pathways, potentially doing supporting activities for staff or members of IFLA, because that's the only way. And recognizing that that will become out of date in 6 months, and then we'll have to start again, and we'll have to start again. So I think it's not a one party on us, but one party has a much stronger convening power, and everyone else has to contribute in that way.
Challenge accepted. In fact, you've preempted the question I was going to ask at the end, so this means I can ask Lisa's instead. But that question about what it is that an organization like IFLA, and we always hesitate to call IFLA an organization because ultimately we're an infrastructure. But how to make that infrastructure work in the best possible way to actually provide some of those answers. But I'm actually going to go to Lisa's question. I should say as well, I think I have seen the chair of our AI special interest group in the attendance list. So I hope he was taking notes on what you were saying there. But let's go to Lisa's question. That will be the final one given time. And she's nice compliment. Not everyone has such inspired leadership as you two. What would you suggest for frontline folks who want to advocate up in their libraries to try and create that kind of space safety in their organization for taking risks, for failing, for taking that more sort of positive, outgoing approach? Who wants to start? Matt?
I'll answer quickly as best I can, and I'm going to put that back on IFLA too, because I think once that infrastructure starts to build resources someone like Lisa can say, look, IFLA is having this discussion. Let's bring this to leadership. Now, the second thing I'm going to say is I feel like librarians, archivist staff, we're all leaders now because we're all sort of experts in whatever domain we happen to exist within this highly complex organization. So Lisa, I would encourage you to take as many leadership courses as you can, and or whomever you are, not Lisa, of course, because her organization is great. She has wonderful leadership. But to do that training and to keep up your curiosity and learning about things that are happening, because it is happening so fast. Like we don't have the luxury of that 10-year, 20-year cycle anymore. Subscribe to that magazine, keep that reading going, and do that leadership training, because in many ways to be an advocate, no matter what it is to be a leader. And so having those advocacy skills will be good for you.
And I would just say, I do feel that question because it's so prevalent. And by the way, having the top leadership advocate for this actually does not mean everyone in the organization would agree with this as well. And because of the hierarchical structures, I think there will be some people who will be like, I don't want you to do this work, but then at least there's a challenge domain there. What I would say is that stop asking for permission. We have a very strong culture of asking for permission in the libraries. And if it is something that you can do that will improve your own work or your own business, just get on with it. And where it will impact wider things, demonstrate the business value. I think not just your own area value, but the wider business value. Demonstrate what would it mean for others. I always say the first question you should always ask is, what if you're speaking with someone about convincing them to do something, ask what's in it for them. And once you can answer that, I think you basically have sold the proposition to them. But I'm not undermining the difficulty that some colleagues face because of the structures they're in. But let go, if I can encourage one thing, let go of that permission seeking culture. And if it's within your gift, just go ahead and do it.
Excellent. I think that's a really good way to close the discussion. I'm conscious we're at half past whatever hour it is where you are, except for those countries that operate with half hours and quarter hours in time zones. I'm also very keen to be respectful of people's time. I know some of you have to go to work now, even if some of us can go to bed. So I just want to say thank you so much. This was such a fantastic way of starting this series, and I think there have been some fantastic insights that I hope everyone who's here, everyone who listens to the recording can take away from this and apply within their own work, but also some really key ideas about, well, how can we working with futures, using futures as almost as a tool for driving cultural change, as well as something that forces us to do it in the first place. So with that, I just want to say huge thanks to Masud, to Matt, for joining at very different ends of the days, very sort of far apart, but fortunately this is something that the internet does allow us to do. We will post the recording of this so you can listen again and spot all the sort of sparks of insight that you may not even have picked up first time around. I'm happy to say the next IFLA Futures Club, look out for it on the internet, but we'll be joined by Patricia Sway from the Mellon Foundation. So it'll be good, and I've been conscious that we're all men on this one, so we're going to balance it out across the series. So with that, thank you so much to absolutely everyone. Thank you for your questions, thank you for your attention, thank you for your presence, and look forward to seeing you at the next IFLA Futures Club. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Masud.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Stephen.